What were continentals?
Continentals were the paper money issued by the U.S. government during the American Revolution, 1775–83. The Second Continental Congress, which governed the new nation after the Declaration of Independence. 1776, ran the war effort against Great Britain. The governing body did not have the power to levy taxes, since no constitution had been drawn up yet. So the Congress appealed to each state to contribute to the war fund. However, states that did not face imminent danger, those in which there was no fighting, often did not answer the call. Many of the new nation's most prominent citizens remained loyal to the British and refused to contribute money to the American patriotic cause. Yet money was needed to buy supplies and ammunition, and to pay soldiers. In order to finance the revolution, Congress was compelled to issue paper bills, which promised holders future payment in silver. But as Congress issued more and more continentals, the currency became devalued because there was not enough silver to back up the promised payments. By 1780 there were so many continentals in circulation that they had become almost worthless. The phrase "not worth a continental" was used by Americans to describe anything that had no value. To help solve the financial crisis, some patriotic citizens contributed sums of money. In exchange, they received interest-bearing securities from the government. But funds continued to be scarce. The problem of funding the revolutionary effort was not solved until foreign powers stepped in to aid the fledgling nation in its fight against the powerful British. European loans to the United States, notably from France, were instrumental in the American victory in the Revolutionary War.
How were Europe's lines redrawn as a result of World War I?
The treaties that came out of the Paris Peace Conference 1919–20, redrew Europe's boundaries, carving new nations out of the defeated powers. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to give up territory to Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, France, and Poland. Germany also forfeited all of its overseas colonies and turned over coal fields to France for the next 15 years. The treaties of Saint-Germain and Trianon toppled the former Empire of Austria-Hungary, whose Archduke had been assassinated in 1914, triggering the war. So that the separate nations of Austria and Hungary were formed, each occupying less than a third of their former area. Their former territory was divided among Italy, Romania, and the countries newly recognized by the treaties: Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the kingdom that later became Yugoslavia. The Treaty of Sèvres took Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, Palestine, and Syria away from the Ottoman Empire, which 3 years later became the Republic of Turkey. Finally, Bulgaria lost territory to Greece and Romania. However, these new borders would serve to heighten tensions between some countries, as the territorial claims of the newly redrawn nations overlapped with each other.
What was the world like between the world wars?
Before World War II began in 1939, World War I, 1914–18, was referred to as the Great War. And understandably so, given its enormous impact. The price of the conflict was paid in human casualties. More than 10 million soldiers died and another 20 million were wounded. Civilian deaths were equally devastating, resulting from widespread hunger and flu epidemics. This was in the days preceding the advent of penicillin to treat complications from influenza. During the 1920s, with the death toll of the Great War a recent memory, the civilized world enjoyed a period of relative peace. In the United States, the decade was known as the Roaring Twenties, 10 years of prosperity and even frivolity. Despite ratification of the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, 1919, which prohibited the sale and consumption of intoxicating liquors. At the close of the Great War, the League of Nations had been established to handle disputes among countries and avoid another major conflict. This was followed in 1928 by the Kellogg-Briand Pact, also called the Pact of Paris, in which 15 nations agreed to settle conflicts by diplomacy rather than military might. Eventually 62 nations ratified the agreement. Meanwhile, in Germany an extreme sense of nationalism was taking hold. The Treaty of Versailles, which had ended the Great War, seriously weakened the nation, allowing the rise of the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945. Nazis were determined to see their beloved homeland rise to power once again. And they found a ready following among the German people. In 1929 a general downturn began in the world economy, triggered by the U.S. stock market crash of late October. As the United States fell into the severe and sustained economic crisis known as the Great Depression. Other industrialized nations including Germany also felt the impact. Unemployment jumped to record levels in many countries, and a lack of social welfare programs resulted in the destitution of numerous families. Politicians and economists alike searched for solutions to the crisis, many turning to anti-free trade or isolationist policies to protect their own. Meanwhile, post-war efforts to keep peace were proving ineffective. Japan invaded Manchuria, China. In 1931, Italy conquered Ethiopia. In 1936, civil war raged in Spain, 1936–39. India became the site of a bitter struggle between British rulers and Indian nationalists, and the Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937 and would be absorbed by the outbreak of World War II, was fought in Asia. A dangerous alliance was forged when Germany, Italy, and Japan formed the Axis powers in 1936. Also, by 1933, Germany had become a totalitarian state known as the Third Reich. In 1938, Nazi armies took their first steps toward gaining supremacy when they marched into Austria and claimed it, setting the stage for World War II, 1939–45.
How does the Great Flood of 1993 compare with other floods?
The flood, which occurred in the summer of 1993, was immense. So much of Iowa was underwater that a satellite image, monitoring moisture on the earth, made the flooded area look like it was the size of Lake Michigan or Lake Superior. The area that was underwater was roughly equivalent to twice the size of Massachusetts. Even so, the Great Flood resulted in a smaller water-covered area than did floods earlier in the century, in 1926 and 1973. Due to heavy rainfall during the spring and summer of 1993, the Mississippi River widened to as much as 7 miles at some points, and the Missouri River also overflowed its banks despite the levee system that had been put in place by the federal government earlier in the century. The flood took 50 lives, displaced 85,000 people from their homes, destroyed 8,000 homes, damaged the contents of another 20,000 homes, stranded 2,000 loaded barges, and resulted in just more than 400 counties being declared disaster areas. The property and crop losses totaled $15 billion.
Who invented the airship?
The airship, a lighter-than-air aircraft that has both propulsion, power, and steering systems, had a long evolution. The first successful power-driven airship was built by French engineer Henry Giffard, 1825–1882, who in September 1852 flew his craft a distance of 17 miles from Paris to Trappes, France, at an average speed of 5 miles per hour. The airship was cigar-shaped with a gondola that supported a 3-horsepower steam engine. Though it included a rudder, the craft proved difficult to steer. Austrian David Schwartz, 1845–1897, is credited with designing the first truly rigid airship. A craft that he piloted unsuccessfully in November 1897, the airship crashed. The inventor whose name is most often associated with airships, also called dirigibles after 1885, is Ferdinand von Zeppelin. 1838–1917, who designed, built, and flew the first successful rigid airship in 1900. The Zeppelin. As the aircraft came to be known, flew at a top speed of about 17 miles per hour. The German aeronaut steadily improved his craft in the years that followed, and in 1906 set up a manufacturing plant where the Zeppelins were built. In 1909 Zeppelin helped establish the world's first commercial airline. The transport was wholly via airship. The craft saw military use during World War I, 1914–18. but after the Hindenburg crashed on landing in New Jersey in 1937, the airships declined dramatically in use. Their decline largely paralleled advances in the development of airplanes.
What were the highlights of the Ming dynasty?
The focus on Chinese culture that was the hallmark of the Ming dynasty. 1368 to 1644 was both its strength and its weakness. After the foreign Mongols, whose dynasty had been established by Kublai Khan in 1260, were overthrown as rulers of China in 1368. The Ming emperors returned their and their subjects' attention to those things that are distinctively Chinese. The focus on Chinese culture produced a flowering in the arts, evidenced by the name Ming itself, meaning bright or brilliant. Architects working during this period produced the splendor of Beijing's Forbidden City. Ming porcelain, bronze, and lacquerware are coveted collector's items today. Additionally, the novel and drama flourished. And though the Ming rulers promoted this artistic renaissance and reinstated Confucianism and the program of civil service suspended by the Mongols, the rulers' myopia prevented them from seeing the threat of the nomadic Manchu people on the horizon. In 1644 the Manchus invaded from the north and conquered China, setting up the last dynastic period in Chinese history. It lasted until 1912. Nevertheless, it was the Ming, and not the Manchu, who formed the last great and truly Chinese dynasty.
When was the Brooklyn Bridge completed?
The bridge, which spans New York's East River to connect Manhattan and Brooklyn, was completed in 1883. Upon opening, it was celebrated as a feat of modern engineering and, with its twin Gothic towers, as an architectural landmark of considerable grace and beauty. It is a high statement of the era and expression of the optimism of the Industrial Revolution. It was designed by German-American engineer John Augustus Roebling, 1806 to 1869, who, upon his death, was succeeded on the project by his son Washington Augustus Roebling, 1837 to 1926. When the Brooklyn Bridge was finished, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world. It measures 1,595 feet. The bridge hangs from steel cables that are almost 16 inches thick. The cables are suspended from stone and masonry towers that are 275 feet tall. Specially designed watertight chambers allowed for the construction of the two towers whose bases are built on the floor of the East River. The project proved to be an enormous and dangerous undertaking. Underwater workers suffered from the bends, a serious and potentially fatal blood condition, caused by the decrease in pressure that results from rising from the water's depth too quickly. But man prevailed against the elements and, following 14 laborious years, on May 24, 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge was inaugurated. 5 years later, Brooklyn became a borough of New York City. And in 1964 the bridge was designated a National Historic Landmark.
Who were the code talkers?
Code talkers were Navajo Indians who provided secure communications for the U.S. military specific operations during World War II, 1939–45. Serving in the Marines, the Navajo servicemen were recruited because of their language, which is unwritten and extremely complex. Military officials believed the Japanese would not be able to decipher intercepted communiques that were transmitted in the Navajo language. The first Navajo recruits attended boot camp in May 1942 and developed and memorized a dictionary of military terms to use in encrypting messages. The trained code talkers were deployed with Marine units throughout the Pacific Theater. They worked around the clock, with tremendous speed and accuracy, to transmit vital information about military tactics, battle orders, and troop movements. Their messages were sent over telephone and radio, because of the complexity of the language. The Japanese military was never able to break the code. About 400 Navajos served as code talkers during the war, contributing mightily to the success of U.S. military assaults at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and other Pacific venues.
When did European colonialism begin?
Seeking out colonies for economic benefit dates back to ancient times. Even the Romans ruled colonies in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. But colonialism took hold during the Renaissance, between 1400 and 1600. When powerful European countries sent explorers to find new lands and forge new trade routes. Portugal and Spain sought sea routes to India and the Far East. In the process, the Portuguese gained control of what is now Brazil. They also established trading posts in West Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Spain gained control of most of Latin America and vast regions of what is now the United States. However, the Dutch, English, and French also had influence in these areas. And of course, the English eventually established 13 colonies in North America. The English also became a strong influence in India and Africa, while the Dutch gained control of the Indonesian islands, which became the Dutch East Indies. The results of colonialism were many. While trade was expanded and there was an enormous exchange of raw goods, the colonies were also rife with conflict. Indigenous peoples were killed or forcibly displaced from their lands, and foreign powers fought with each other for control of the same areas. The British and French fought 4 wars in North America between 1689 and 1763 alone. Further, Europeans brought to these new lands their own languages, religions, and systems of government, imposing their culture, beliefs, and ideologies on native peoples.
What does laissez-faire mean?
From the French, laissez-faire literally means to let people do as they choose. As an economic doctrine, laissez-faire opposes government interference in economic and business matters, or at least desires to keep government's role to an absolute minimum. Laissez-faire favors a free market, a market characterized by open competition. The theory was popularized during the late 18th century as a reaction to mercantilism. Noted Scottish economist Adam Smith, 1723–1790, was among the advocates of a laissez-faire market.
When was the first hospital established in North America?
It was in 1503 when the Spanish built a hospital in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, then known as Hispaniola. It is no longer in existence, but ruins remain. On the North American mainland, the first hospital was opened in Quebec, Canada, in 1639. The first incorporated hospital in the United States was the Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia. Chartered in 1751 with the support of statesman Benjamin Franklin, 1706–1790.
Why did people first believe that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah?
In his lifetime, Jesus of Nazareth, c. 6 BCE AD 30, was believed to be the Messiah for many reasons. These reasons are explained in detail in the New Testament, particularly in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. First, Jesus was thought to have been miraculously conceived by Mary, a virgin. In Luke 2:8-20, an angel is described as having spoken to shepherds tending their fields, telling them that in this night in the city of David, a Savior is born unto you, a Messiah, the Lord. And goes on to say that the sign of the Messiah is that they will find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes. Also in Luke 2:36-38, a prophetess arrives and proclaims Mary's baby to be the child to all who were looking for the liberation of the Jews. Further, Jesus proclaimed himself to be the Son of God, as described, for example, in John 5:17-23. He demonstrated extraordinary healing powers, used parables to teach moral and spiritual ways, and carried a message of God's redeeming love. All of this was convincing enough that many, mostly the common people, became disciples or followers of Christ during his lifetime.
Why was Socrates condemned to death?
Socrates, c. 470 to 399 BC, the Greek philosopher who is credited, along with philosophers Plato, c. 428 to 347 BC. And Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, for laying the foundations of Western thought, had many followers in his own time. However, his ideas and methods were controversial, too, which led him to be tried before judges and sentenced to death, which he carried out by drinking hemlock, poison. He had been charged for not worshipping the Athenian gods and for corrupting the young.
Who was Cesar Chavez?
Mexican-American farm worker Cesar Chavez, 1927 to 1993. Was a labor union organizer and spokesperson of the poor. Born in Arizona, his family lost their farm when he was just 10 years old. They became migrant workers in California, where farm production, particularly of grape crops, depended on the temporary laborers. Chavez knew the migrant workers' life intimately, and as a young man he began working to improve conditions for his people. In 1962 he organized California grape pickers into the National Farm Workers Association. 4 years later this union merged with another to form the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, or UFWOC. The name was changed to the United Farm Workers of America, or UFW, in 1973. An impassioned speaker known for squishing bunches of grapes in his hands as he delivered his messages, Chavez went on to lead a nationwide boycott of table grapes, since growers had refused to accept the collective bargaining of the UFWOC. By the close of the 1970s, California growers of all crops had accepted the Migrant Workers Union, now called the United Farm Workers. Like Martin Luther King Jr., Chavez maintained that nonviolent protest was the key to achieving change.
What does Wagnerian mean?
It is a reference to anything that is in the style of German composer Richard Wagner, 1813 to 1883. Wagner was an enormously creative composer, conductor, and artistic manager who is credited with no less than originating the music drama. His interest in theater began in his boyhood, and by his teens he was writing plays. So that he could put music to these works, he sought out composition teachers. It is no surprise then that Wagner later conceived of the idea of the total work of art, where music, poetry, and the visual arts are brought together in one stunning performance piece. As an adult, Wagner led a scandalous life, even today challenging the music-listening public to separate his life from his art. He was someone modern audiences would recognize as a truly gifted and charismatic, if amoral, artist, working on a grand scale. Were he alive now, Wagner might well be creating blockbusters. In fact, his musical compositions are heard in movies, including Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, and are familiar to even the youngest audience today, or at least those who watch Bugs Bunny cartoons. But this is not to take away from Wagner's serious accomplishments. His most widely recognized operatic works include Lohengrin, 1848, The Ring Cycle, 1848-74, and Tristan und Isolde, 1859. In the decades after his death, Wagner's reputation grew to the point that through the end of the 19th century his influence was felt by most every composer, who often referred to Wagner's works in measuring the value of their own.
How did the birth control movement get started?
The decline in death rates, which has meant an overall increase in the world population, gave rise to the birth control movement. Scientific advances during the 18th and 19th centuries resulted in better food supplies, the control of diseases, and safer work environments for those living in developed countries. These improvements combined with progress in medicine to save and prolong human lives. During the 1800s, the birth rate, which in earlier times had been offset by the death rate, became a concern to many who worried that population growth would outstrip the planet's ability to provide adequate resources to sustain life. In 1798, British economist and sociologist Thomas Robert Malthus, 1766–1834, published his essay on the principle of population, arguing that populations tend to increase faster than do food supplies. He thereby concluded that poverty and suffering are unavoidable. Malthus viewed only war, famine, disease, and moral restraint as checks on population growth. In spite of or because of Malthus's assertions, during the 1800s the idea of birth control as a practical method to keep population growth in check gained momentum. Early in the 1900s the movement found a leader in American Margaret Higgins Sanger, 1883–1966, whose personal experience as a nurse working among the poor had convinced her that limiting family size is necessary for social progress. She became convinced that unwanted pregnancy should be avoided by using birth control methods. It was and remains controversial. Even though the distribution of birth control information was illegal at the time, Sanger advised people on the subject. In 1914 she founded a magazine called The Woman Rebel, and she sent birth control information through the mail. She was arrested and indicted. But she was not deterred. In 1916 in Brooklyn, New York, Sanger founded the first birth control clinic in the United States. In 1921 she organized the first American birth control conference, held in New York. That same year she founded the American Birth Control League, which later became the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. As public support for the movement increased, Sanger succeeded in getting laws passed that allowed doctors to disseminate birth control information to their patients. In other countries, Sanger's work inspired similar movements. But developed nations continue to have lower birth rates than do developing nations. With the world population exceeding 5.5 billion. The fear of overpopulation had prompted new interest in birth control.
What were the deadliest volcanic eruptions in history?
The April 5, 1815, eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia was the deadliest yet, killing some 92,000 people. Another Indonesian eruption later in the 19th century, this time at Krakatau, claimed 36,417 lives in late August 1883. On the French island of Martinique in the West Indies. Mount Pelee erupted on August 30, 1902, and more than 29,000 people perished. A relatively recent and deadly eruption was that on November 13, 1985, at Nevada del Ruiz, Colombia. It claimed 23,000 lives. Iceland's Skaptur volcano erupted in 1783. While the number of lives lost may not qualify it for inclusion on a short list of deadliest volcanoes, the human toll was great indeed. 20% of the country's population died. Because of population growth, today more people live closer to volcanoes, both active and inactive. As a result, the number of volcano-related deaths has increased. Between the years 1600 and 1900, the estimated average death toll per year due to volcanoes was 315. Since the beginning of the 20th century, an average of 845 people have died each year because of volcanic eruptions.
Who was Cabeza de Vaca?
Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, c. 1490 – 1560, was a Spanish explorer who in 1527 joined an expedition to the New World. And because of his reports that he believed the area north of Mexico might be rich in precious metals. Other Spanish explorers were later inspired to explore the region. After landing in Florida in 1527, Cabeza de Vaca and a few others, including the black explorer Estevanico, became separated from the ships. The men built a barge and sailed across the Gulf of Mexico from northern Florida to the islands off the Texas coast, where their ship was wrecked. In 1528 Cabeza de Vaca was imprisoned by the Indians there. He escaped by 1530 and set out on foot through northern Mexico, exploring the region for some 5 years. Proceeding south, in 1536 Cabeza de Vaca reached Mexico City, which was then the capital of Spain's North American holdings. He returned to Spain the following year. In 1541 the explorer led an expedition to the Rio de la Plata region, of southern South America, and reached Asunción, in present-day Paraguay. In 1542, Cabeza de Vaca was appointed the Spanish colonial governor of Paraguay, a position he held for 2 years. He proved to be an inept leader, was deposed by the colonists, and returned to Spain. There he was banished to service in Africa.
What were the Crusades?
The Crusades were a series of 9 Christian military expeditions that took place during the end of the 11th century and throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. The stated goal of the Crusades was to recover from the Muslims the Holy Land of Palestine, where Jesus Christ, C6b.ca.d30, lived.
What was the monkey trial?
The July 1925 trial of Dayton, Tennessee, public school teacher John T. Scopes, 1900-1970, was dubbed the monkey trial because at issue was Scopes's teaching of evolution in his classroom. Having yielded to religious beliefs in creationism, the story of human origins told in the Bible's book of Genesis. Tennessee state law prohibited teaching public school students about the theories of English naturalist Charles Darwin, 1809–1882. Darwin's scientifically credible work The Origin of Species argued that humans had descended from ape-like creatures. Celebrated attorney Clarence Darrow, 1857–1938, defended Scopes. Lawyer and former presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan, 1860–1925, known as the Great Commoner, argued the prosecution. For 12 days in the summer of 1925, the small town in eastern Tennessee became the site of a showdown between modern scientific thought and traditional fundamentalism. Or as some observed, between cosmopolitan and rural America. Spectators crowded the courtroom, eventually forcing the proceedings to be moved to the courthouse lawn. Journalists issued daily reports, which were published in newspapers across the country. It was headline writers who dubbed the case the monkey trial. Darrow made history when he called Bryan himself to the stand. It was a daring move on the defense attorney's part. But since Bryan eagerly accepted the summons, the judge allowed the questioning. Darrow first got Bryan to agree that every word in the Bible is true. Then he set in to reveal the hazards of such a literal interpretation, asking, for example, how Cain had found himself a wife if he, Adam, Eve, and Abel were the only 4 people on earth at the time. Darrow succeeded in shaking the prosecutor, who finally admitted that he did not believe Earth was made in 6 days. Bryan retaliated by accusing Darrow of insulting the Bible, to which Darrow replied, "I am examining you on your fool ideas that no Christian on earth believes." It was drama better than any novelist could write. Darrow lost the case, which was later overturned on a technicality. Scopes had only been charged a $100 fine for violating the state law, which was repealed in 1967. But the trial, preserved in the play and film Inherit the Wind, is still remembered today. Scopes's crime was not sensational, his trial did not break any legal ground. And the defense had not won a brilliant victory, but the proceedings, carried out in the midsummer heat of the American South, epitomized the era and, ultimately, made for a great story.
How many died in the September 11th attacks?
About 3,000 people died that day as a result of the terrorist attacks on the United States. The strikes on New York's World Trade Center claimed 2,602 lives. And another 125 died at the Pentagon, outside Washington, D.C. The numbers include firefighters and police officers who died as part of the rescue effort. The victims on board the hijacked flights, which were used as terrorist weapons, numbered an additional 87 on American Airlines Flight 11, which crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 60 on United Airlines Flight 175, which crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 59 on American Airlines Flight 77, which slammed into the Pentagon. And 40 on United Airlines Flight 93, which crashed in rural Shanksville, Pennsylvania. In February 2005, officials announced that they had exhausted all possible methods of identifying the human remains recovered at Ground Zero. Of the 2,749 people reported missing at the World Trade Center, positive identification had been made on 1,161 people. The rest were presumed dead. 2,749 death certificates were issued related to the World Trade Center attack.
How many musical backs were there?
Johann Sebastian Bach, 1685 to 1750. Was only one of a long and extended line of competent musicians, some 14 of them. The Bach family was a musical dynasty. JS's father, Ambrosius Bach, 1645 to 1695. Was a court musician for the Duke of Eisenach, and several of J.S. Bach's close relatives were organists in churches. His eldest brother, Johann Christoph Bach, 1671 to 1721, was apprenticed to the famous German composer Johann Pachelbel. 1653 to 1706, J.S. Bach left a musical legacy even beyond the vast body of church, vocal, and instrumental music that he composed. 4 of his sons and 1 grandson were also accomplished musicians. The English Bach refers to J.S.'s son Johann Christian Bach, 1735 to 1782. Who composed operas, oratorios, arias, cantatas, symphonies, concertos, and chamber music. A proponent of Rococo-style music, J.C. Bach influenced Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, 1756 to 1791.
When did the major combat phase of Operation Iraqi Freedom end?
President George W. Bush, 1946, declared an end to major combat on May 1, 2003. But the stabilization of Iraq was far from over. The fighting continued more than 2 years later, the result of an increasingly violent Iraqi insurgency. Faced with the ongoing resistance, in December 2004 the number of U.S. troops in the war-torn nation was increased from 130,000 to 150,000. Most of the casualties occurred after the declared end of major combat. On April 8, 2005, the Pentagon reported that there had been 1,543 American fatalities in the war to date, 1,174 in hostile actions and 369 in non-hostile actions, including accidents during routine maneuvers. Of the 1,543 U.S. military deaths, 1,404 died after the declared end of major combat, 1,065 of them from hostile action. More than 7,000 had been injured to date. In addition to the American fatalities, the British military had reported 86 deaths as of early April 2005, Italy 21, Ukraine 18, Poland 17, Spain 11, Bulgaria 8, Slovakia 3, Estonia, Thailand, and the Netherlands 2 each, and Denmark, El Salvador, Hungary, Kazakhstan, and Latvia 1 each. The figures fueled criticism for the lingering war, with some observers wondering if stabilization was possible in the fractious nation. There were several factors contributing to the growing lists of casualties and injuries. Coalition forces were frequently ambushed in attacks from resistance fighters and suicide bombers. U.S. troops faced continued combat in parts of Baghdad and its outskirts. The southern towns of Najaf and Kufa were holdouts of resistance, and there was intense fighting in the Sunni cities of Fallujah, Ramadi, and Samarra, which remained under insurgent control even after the transfer of political authority from the United States to the interim Iraqi Authority on June 28, 2004.
Who were the Danes?
The Danes are the Scandinavian people of Denmark. Their origins date as far back as 100,000 years. Beginning at about the time of Christ, c. 30 AD. The Danes were organized into communities that were governed by local chieftains. During the 6th and 7th centuries they participated in the Viking, pirate, raids of England, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. These last three are sometimes referred to as the Low Countries. In about 950 Denmark was united by King Harald II, also called Harald Bluetooth, c. 910 c. 985. Who 10 years later was converted to Christianity and thereafter fostered its spread. The Vikings gained control of England in 1016, and the Dane warrior Canute became king of England, and of Denmark. The Danes ruled England until 1042.
How did the textile industry begin?
The large-scale factory production of textiles began in the late 1700s, becoming established first in Great Britain, where a cotton spinning machine was invented in 1783 by Richard Arkwright, 1732 to 1792. Spinning mills were introduced to the United States in 1790 by English-born machinist and businessman Samuel Slater, 1768 to 1835. The 21-year-old had worked as a textile laborer for more than 6 years in an English mill where he learned the workings of Arkwright's machine, which the British considered the cornerstone of their booming textiles industry. Laws prevented anyone with knowledge of the mill from leaving the country. In 1789 Slater, determined he could recreate the spinning mill and eager to seek his own fortune, disguised himself to evade the authorities and leave the country, sailing from England for American shores. Arriving in Providence, Rhode Island, he formed a partnership with the textiles firm Amey and Brown. Slater began building a spinning mill based on the Arkwright machine. This he did from memory. The spinning mill was debuted December 20, 1790, in the village of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where the wheels of the mill were turned by the waters of the Blackstone River. The machine was a success and soon revolutionized the American textiles industry, which previously relied on cottage workers, the putting out system, to manufacture thread and yarn. Slater's innovation, which would earn him the title father of the American textiles industry, spawned the factory system in the United States. By 1815 there were 165 cotton mills in New England, all working to capacity. The early mills were not large-scale, however, and for a time after Slater's introductions, New England mills and merchants continued to rely on home workers to weave threads, now produced by the mills, into cloth. In 1813 the Boston Manufacturing Company opened the first textile factory, where laborers ran spinning and weaving machines to produce woven cloth from start to finish. The advent of machinery had given rise to the factory system, and laborers were shifted from working in their homes to working in factories, while native New Englanders continued to provide the labor for the textile industry for the next 2 decades. An influx of immigrants in the mid-1800s provided the hungry manufacturers with a steady supply of laborers who were willing to work for less money and longer hours. Within the first 3 decades of the 1800s, New England became the center of the nation's textiles industry. The region's ample rivers and streams provided the necessary water power, and the commercial centers of Boston and New York City readily received the finished products. Labor proved to be in ample supply as well. Since the mill machinery was not complicated, children could operate it and did. Slater hired children ages 7 to 14 to run the mill. a practice that other New England textile factories also adopted. The Jefferson Embargo of 1807, which prohibited importing textiles, also aided the industry. New England's mills provided the model for the American factory system. Slater had brought the Industrial Revolution to America.
What happened at China's Tiananmen Square?
In 1989, Beijing's Tiananmen Square, the largest public square in the world, became the site of a student protest and massacre. 3 years before the demonstration, freedom of speech and other democratic beliefs began being espoused on university campuses. In increasing numbers, China's youth were demanding political reform. They found a sympathizer in the General Secretary, the highest-ranking officer of the Communist Party, Hu Yaobang, 1915 to 1989, who, despite criticism from conservatives in government, adhered to his liberal views, particularly concerning freedom of expression. In January 1987, Hu was removed from his post. He died in April 1989, at which time students organized marches in his honor and demonstrated in favor of democratic reforms. On June 4, 1989, Chinese troops fired on the protesters in Tiananmen Square, killing more than 200 and later arresting anyone thought to be involved in China's pro-democracy movement. The actions raised fury around the world. International observers continued to monitor the tenuous situation in China, where evidence surfaced that the government was continuing its pattern of human rights violations.
What is the worst airplane accident in history?
With thousands of accidents since the beginning of aviation history, records differentiate among ground collision, mid-air collision, and single aircraft accidents. Some records differentiate by cause, including pilot error, weather, and fuel starvation. The worst ground collision and the deadliest airplane accident in history was the Tenerife disaster of March 27, 1977, which killed 583 people. Two Boeing 747 airliners ran into each other on Tenerife, in the Canary Islands, Atlantic Ocean. One was a Pan Am flight, the Clipper Victor, which originated at Los Angeles International Airport, made a stop at New York's JFK Airport, and was headed for the Canary Islands. It was diverted to Tenerife at the last minute due to a bomb threat at its destination airport on neighboring Las Palmas Island. The other 747 was a KLM flight, the Flying Dutchman, originating in Amsterdam. It, too, was diverted to Las Palmas's Los Rodeos Airport because of the threat there. On takeoff, the KLM plane slammed into the taxiing Pan Am plane. Heavy fog on the runway contributed to the disaster, but there were communication problems as well. According to tower records, The KLM flight had not yet been cleared for takeoff. Upon collision, the jumbo jets burst into flames. There were only 61 survivors. 54 passengers and 7 crew members, all from the Pan Am flight. The worst mid-air collision happened on November 12, 1996, over Charkadadri, India. 349 people perished when a Saudi Arabian Airlines Boeing 747 collided with a Kazakh Ilyushin Il-76 aircraft. There were no survivors. The worst single-plane accident happened on August 12, 1985, when a Japan Airlines Boeing 747 crashed into a mountain on a domestic flight, killing 520 people. There were 4 survivors, all of them passengers.
How old is nationalism?
Nationalism, a people's sense that they belong together as a nation because of a shared history and culture, and often because of a common language and/or religion, emerged at the close of the Middle Ages, 500-1350. By the 1700s, several countries, notably England, France, and Spain, had developed as nation-states. Groups of people with a shared background who occupy a land that is governed independently. As political and economic entities, the nation-states were preceded by fiefs, tribes, city-states, and empires, which overlapped each other as organizing units, dividing people's loyalties. By the 1800s, nationalism had become a powerful force, and the view took hold that any national group has the right to form its own state. Because of this belief, called national self-determination, some nations achieved independence, including Greece, which gained freedom from Turkey in 1829, and Belgium, which won self-rule from the Netherlands in 1830. Others formed new, larger countries. Both Italy and Germany were created by the unification of numerous smaller states, Italy in 1870 and Germany 1 year later. And still others carved smaller states out of great empires, for example, the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire following World War I 1914-18 resulted in the formation of the independent countries of Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and, later, Yugoslavia. In the United States, nationalism in the 1800s took the form of Manifest Destiny, the mission to expand the country's boundaries to include as much of North America as possible. By the end of the century, the United States had claimed all of its present-day territory. While nationalism is a source of pride and patriotism and has had many positive results, some leaders, notably German dictator Adolf Hitler 1889-1945, have carried it to extremes, initiating large-scale movements that resulted in the persecution of other peoples and in the hideous practice of ethnic cleansing. The boundary lines that were drawn on the world map at the end of the 20th century were largely the result of nationalistic movements, some of which had resulted in conflicts and some of which remained unresolved.
How disastrous was the San Francisco earthquake?
The quake of 1906 struck at 5:12 a.m. on April 18, and registered 8.3 on the Richter scale. 20 seconds of trembling were followed by 45 to 60 seconds of shocks. The quake cracked water and gas mains, which resulted in a fire that lasted 3 days and destroyed 2/3 of the city. The destruction and loss of lives were great, as many as 3,000, of San Francisco's 400,000 people were killed. The entire business district was demolished, 3 out of 5 homes had either crumbled or burned. 250,000 to 300,000 people were left homeless, and 490 city blocks were destroyed. The quake was a milestone for American journalism, the offices of the city's newspapers. The Examiner, owned by William Randolph Hearst, 1863 to 1951, The Call, and the Chronicle had all burned. But the first day after the disaster, the 3 papers joined forces across the Bay in Oakland to print a combined edition, the California Chronicle Examiner. Across the country, Will Irwin, 1873 to 1948, of the New York Sun, who had been a reporter and editor at the San Francisco Chronicle from 1900 to 1904, wrote a story titled "The City That Was," which he completed from memory alone. It was picked up by papers around the country and became a classic of journalism. The San Francisco tragedy demonstrated the newfound ability of the American press to create an instant national story out of a local event. The Bay Area was hit again by a sizable quake in 1989. As millions tuned in to watch the World Series at Candlestick Park outside San Francisco, the TV cameras began to shake. Because of media coverage of the baseball game, the earthquake had literally been broadcast live around the world. Once again, fires resulted from broken gas mains, and the damage was extensive. The so-called Loma Pietra quake registered 7.1 on the Richter scale, claimed 67 lives, and damaged $15 billion worth of property. San Francisco's Marina District was particularly hard hit, at least in part due to the fact that the area was built largely on landfill, including debris from the 1906 quake. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 remains the worst to ever hit an American city.
What is international law?
As interpreted by Dutch jurist and humanist Hugo Grotius, 1583 to 1645. Natural law prescribes the rules of conduct among nations, resulting in international laws. His 1625 work, titled Concerning the Law of War and Peace, is considered the definitive text on international law, asserting the sovereignty and legal equality of all states of the world. But the notion also had its detractors. English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, among them. Hobbes insisted that since international law is not enforced by any legal body above the nations themselves, it is not legitimate. Since the 17th century, however, international law has evolved to become more than just theory. During the 1800s and early 1900s, the Geneva Conventions 1864, 1906, 1929, 1949, and the Hague Conferences, 1899, 1907, set forth the rules of war. Today, treaties, between two or among many countries, customary laws, legal writings, and conventions all influence international law, which is also referred to as the law of nations. Further, it is enforced by the International Court of Justice, a United Nations body, as well as by world opinion, international sanctions, and the intervention of the United Nations, apart from the International Court of Justice.
What are the characteristics of Botticelli's paintings?
The works of Sandro Botticelli, 1445 to 1510, one of the early painters of the Italian Renaissance, are known for their serene compositions, refined elegance, and spirituality. A student of Florentine painter Fra Filippo Lippi, 1406 to 1469. Botticelli refined Lippi's method of drawing such that he is considered one of the great masters of the line. Botticelli's work was soon eclipsed by that of Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519. Who was just a few years younger than he, but whose range of talents made Botticelli's work seem dated. Nevertheless, late in the 19th century, Botticelli began to be revered again by artists and critics alike, who hailed his works for their simplicity and sincerity. English art critic John Ruskin, 1819 to 1900, held Botticelli up as an example of an artist who presented nature as an expression of a divinely created world.
What was the Virginia Plan?
It was the famous plan, drafted by James Madison, 1751 to 1836. Put forth by the Virginia delegates to the Constitutional Convention, which convened on May 25, 1787. After taking a few days to set the ground rules and elect officers, on May 29 the delegation from Virginia, led by Edmund Jennings Randolph, 1753 to 1813, proposed a plan to write an all-new constitution. Rather than attempting to revise and correct the weak Articles of Confederation, there was opposition, sometimes called the New Jersey Plan, and the issue was debated for weeks. Eventually, a majority vote approved the Virginia Plan and the delegates began work, drafting a document that would provide a strong national government for the United States.
What is the Irish question?
The Irish question is an ages-old and very complicated problem that encompasses issues of land ownership, religion, and politics between Ireland and Britain. The chronology of events is, 12th century, a feudal landowning system is imposed on Ireland by the British, creating an absentee landlord class and an impoverished Irish peasantry. 1700s, the English try to impose Protestantism on a largely Catholic Ireland, Irish rebellions flare. 1801, the Act of Union unites England and Ireland, forming the United Kingdom. Though Ireland has representation in Parliament, it is divided. 1800s, the British Crown begins to populate the 6 counties of the northeastern Irish province of Ulster with Scottish and British settlers, giving the area a decidedly Protestant character. The division deepens between the 26 counties of Southern Ireland and Ulster. The north becomes increasingly industrialized and Protestant, while the south remains agricultural and Catholic. 1840s, Irish discontent with British rule heightens when a great famine strikes Ireland, resulting in widespread hunger, illness, and death. Many who survive emigrate to seek a better life elsewhere. 1858, a secret revolutionary society forms in Ireland and among Irish emigrants in the United States. Called the Fenian Movement, the group's objective is to achieve Irish independence from England by force. Fenians stage rebellions, which are suppressed by the British. 1868, the head of the Liberal Party, William Gladstone, 1809–1898, becomes British Prime Minister. He will be Prime Minister 3 more times during the last 4 decades of the century. Gladstone becomes an advocate for the peaceful settlement of the Irish question. 1870, Parliament passes the First Land Act, encouraging British landlords to sell land and providing reduced-rate loans to Irish tenants wishing to buy land. 1875, Irish nationalist leader C.S. Parnell, 1846–1891, enters British Parliament. He uses filibusters to prevent Parliament from discussing anything but the Irish question. 1886. C.S. Parnell forms an alliance with Prime Minister William Gladstone. The first Home Rule Bill, providing for Irish self-government, is introduced in Parliament but fails to pass. 1893, the second Home Rule Bill is introduced in Parliament. It is passed by the House of Commons but fails to be passed by the Lords. 1905, an Irish nationalistic movement called Sinn Féin, meaning we ourselves, forms under the leadership of Arthur Griffith, 1872–1922. The group seeks to establish an economically and politically independent Ireland. 1912, the Third Home Rule Bill is introduced in Parliament. Again, the House of Commons passes the legislation providing for Irish self-government. Fearing domination by Catholic Southern Ireland in the event of Irish Home Rule, there is agitation including threat of civil war in Ulster, Northern Ireland. To prevent the outbreak of violence, The Lords exclude Ulster Ireland from the provisions of the Home Rule Bill. It does not take effect due to continued unrest. 1916, refusing to accept the divided Ireland proscribed by the British Parliament, revolutionary Sinn Féin member Michael Collins. 1890 to 1922, organizes a guerrilla movement led by the Irish Republican Army, IRA. The nationalist organization becomes dedicated to the unification of Ireland. 1920, Parliament passes the Government of Ireland Act, establishing separate domestic legislatures for the North and South, as well as continued representation in British Parliament. The 6 northern counties of Ireland accept the Act and become Northern Ireland. The 26 southern counties refuse to accept the legislation. 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty is signed, providing for the 26 counties of Southern Ireland to become the Irish Free State, now the Republic of Ireland. 1922, the Irish Free State, headed by Sinn Féin leader Arthur Griffith, is officially declared. It gradually severs its ties to Britain. 1927, Sinn Féin ends as a movement, but some intransigent members join the IRA. And Sinn Féin becomes the political arm of the Irish Revolutionary Army. 1939 to 45, IRA violence and its pro-German stance cause both Irish governments to outlaw the organization, which goes underground. 1969, the IRA splits into an official majority, which disclaims violence, and a provisional wing, which stages attacks on British troops in Northern Ireland via random bombings and other terrorist acts. Still determined to forge a unified and independent Ireland, the IRA continues to stage acts of violence into the 1990s. At times, bombings become part of everyday life in Belfast, Northern Ireland. London is also the target of random IRA bomb attacks. June 6, 1996, Britain and Ireland agree on an agenda for multi-party peace negotiations on Northern Ireland. But finding ways to disarm Northern Ireland's rival guerrilla groups remains an obstacle to political settlement. April 10, 1998, a Good Friday Peace Accord is signed by Catholic and Protestant leaders who agree to form a multi-party administration by October. Disarmament will remain a sticking point to moving this agreement forward. May 22, 1998, 71% of voters in Northern Ireland vote for an agreement on a power-sharing government, which is also backed by 94% of the voters in the Republic of Ireland. The peace agreement is designed to heal the divisions between Catholics and Protestants that have left 3,400 dead, 40,000 injured, and millions of dollars of property damage. Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern, 1951. Has a simple message for those who still aim to promote violence: forget it. The people on whose behalf you claim to act have spoken. Your ways are the ways of the past. August 15, 1998, violence is renewed when a car bomb in Omagh, Northern Ireland, kills 28 people and injures 220. The real IRA a dissident faction of the Irish Republican Army, claims responsibility. October 16, 1998, the leaders of Northern Ireland's two main political parties win the Nobel Prize for their efforts to end 3 decades of religious-inspired violence in the British province. John Hume, 1937, a Catholic, heads the Social Democratic and Labour Party, whose membership is predominantly Roman Catholic. David Trimble, 1944. A Protestant, leads the Ulster Unionist Party, consisting of pro-British Protestants. December 1998, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, 1953. Tries to jumpstart the stalled Good Friday peace agreement. Catholic and Protestant politicians have failed to set up the multi-party administration to which they had agreed. Leaders have been hampered in their efforts to do so by the question of disarmament. Protestants demand exclusion of the Sinn Féin party from government until its military wing, the IRA, disarms. Blair also presses for North-South bodies, committees that will oversee cooperation between the Irish Republic and Northern Ireland on matters of industry, tourism, and transportation. Blair insists that his government will hold all parties to a May 2000 disarmament deadline. 2000, the disarmament deadline is not met. October 23, 2001, the IRA promises to disarm in order to save the peace process. 2002, the peace process is suspended after police discover that the IRA is operating a spy ring inside Northern Ireland government offices. Sporadic violence continues. Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern and other major political figures in the Republic of Ireland move to distance themselves from Sinn Féin, the IRA's political arm. December 2004, Belfast's Northern Bank is robbed of $50 million the week before Christmas. The biggest heist in the history of British crime is believed to have been carried out by the IRA to fund its operations. Early 2005, despite the Good Friday Agreement, the IRA has not yet disarmed. According to news reports, IRA gunmen have become an increasingly mafia-like crime organization, involved in drug trafficking, extortion, money laundering, and the violence associated with those criminal activities. In a January 30 Belfast pub brawl, Robert McCartney, an amiable forklift operator, is murdered in what the perpetrators tell pub patrons is IRA business. Though witnesses are intimidated, McCartney's sisters are not. The 5 women demand that the IRA be held accountable for the slaying. The McCartney sisters are hailed as heroes for their courage to speak out against the IRA and are embraced by Sinn Féin. But Sinn Féin's electoral prospects dimmed in the aftermath of the murder. The event provides another roadblock to peace. July 2005, the IRA renounces the use of violence in its fight against British rule in Northern Ireland. The group vows to disarm and to use only peaceful means in its ongoing efforts. The announcement is widely hailed